Good morning, everyone. Welcome to a panel hosted by Center for Financial Crime and Security Studies at RUSI, a defense and security think tank based in London and in Brussels. In our discussion today, we are considering the growing issue of finance and statecraft, and specifically the topic financial warfare. Are democracies ready to fight? Threats, defense, and offense. My name is Kinga Redłowska, and I'm program manager at RUSI Europe. For a quarter of a century, illicit finance from Russia has poured into the EU, undermining its stability. As hostile states are increasingly weaponizing finance, it's time to apply a national security lens to financial threats and to strengthen European security and democracy, to stop viewing illicit finance as a purely criminal issue. Shortcomings on democracy's side allow hostile states to exploit loopholes to not only undermine, in general, the security of EU member states and the EU, but also subvert the part that the EU must play in the response of the West to the Russian war in Ukraine in particular, and efforts to combat illicit finance more generally. And I'm joined today by Justyna Gudzowska, Director of Illicit Finance Policy at the Sentry, Tom Keating, Director of the Center for Financial Crime and Security Studies at RUSI, Franz Wild from the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, and Sam Green, Director of Democratic Resilience at SIPA. And we will be discussing finance and the statecraft, and the conversation will revolve around four main themes: the threat landscape in Europe, raising defense, and the offense. And we will also consider whether the West can win this war alone. So let's start with the threat landscape in Europe and beyond. The Russian war in Ukraine has shocked the stability of Europe and brought to the fore the role of finance and international security. It has uncovered a range of malign actions of states such as Russia and China in Europe and beyond, and these overt and covert financial activities undermine European democracy and security. And the question to all panelists is, what is the biggest threat in the financial landscape that undermines democracy? And Tom, I would like to start with you. The CFCS, Center for Financial Crime and Security Studies, you founded in 2014, focuses on the intersection of illicit finance and security. And today, almost 20 team members deep dive and immerse into nuanced aspects of this subject on a daily basis. So what do you view as the biggest threat based on your and your team's years-long research and work?
Okay, well, thank you for the introductions, and thank you all for coming, and hopefully hello to those of you watching from Europe online over your lunch. So, I mean, one of the things, when we started the program at RUSI, of course, the big focus was 2014, and the big focus, or the main focus, was on non-state-based threats, so terrorist financing, organized crime groups, and so on. But obviously, in more recent years, evidence has emerged, and I think we need to be careful not to, do that thing about the plural of anecdote being evidence. But evidence is clearly emerging of, far greater use of finance as a vector for state-based threats, and we can kind of unpack what that means, perhaps. The biggest threat that I see is actually the naivety and negligence, if you want to be stronger, of Western leaders. Because we, of course, champion the fact that we have open borders. We champion the fact that, some of us are old enough to remember that when you couldn't take more than a certain amount of money on holiday to France or whatever it was because of capital controls and that kind of thing. But we champion now that we have these open financial borders. But what we've really failed to do anywhere, even in a well-resourced nation like the United States, is we failed to kind of really ask ourselves what money is coming into our countries and what is then happening to that money. And our response has been built, obviously, around the Financial Action Task Force, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with. And that response has been built around identifying the proceeds of crime, not necessarily identifying money that maybe coming into our countries, which is ostensibly clean, but which perhaps has a desire to do harm or to fund political parties or whatever it might be. We can all think of examples. So for me, the biggest threat, and I have to say, when we thought about this panel, it was before, for example, the speech of Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission President, where she did actually, I think possibly for the first time, acknowledge the risk to European democracy of, quote, shady finance. But I think the biggest risk is that we just don't acknowledge this threat, that we focus constantly on the criminal dimension of dirty money and don't realize that these open societies and these open borders that we've created actually lead to vulnerabilities that we don't seem to be taking seriously, or at least don't seem to be equipped to deal with.
And precisely these themes will be the focus of a newly established task force at RUSI that concentrates on countering state threats.
It will be.
Okay, so Justina, you worked as an expert on counter-terrorist financing at the United Nations and as an attorney advisor for OFAC before that. So you are well aware of the fragmentation and complexity of the current threat landscape. But if you were to point to a single threat that undermines the financial resilience of nations across the globe, what would that be?
Thank you, Kinga, and good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. So as Kinga said, I've worked and worn many different hats over my career in the private sector, public sector, government. Now I'm at an NGO that focuses on anti-corruption and following illicit money linked to grand corruption and atrocities around the world. And what I've really witnessed across my jobs, what I think is the biggest threat, is that we all tend to work in our silos, work in our own bubbles. We're all here at an anti-corruption conference. There are a lot of anti-corruption civil society experts, but there are not that many private sector experts, right? I think when I worked at a bank, I would go to conferences and there were tons of people at banks talking about their issues, but they didn't really hear civil society voice. So I think the biggest threat is that we don't talk to each other enough. The bad guys, the corrupt guys, they have teams of people advising them. They have people that work across jurisdictions, they work across professions, they work across areas of expertise. We need to do the same. I was at a CFT conference a few weeks ago, hosted by RUSI as well, and there were tons of countering the terrorism of financing people, great knowledge, but can we use what we've learned with countering the financing of terrorism to counter other actors, such as the Wagner Group, which is a state-sponsored group that is now becoming, having bigger influence in continents such as Africa? Can we use the lessons learned from other disciplines and use them to counter current threats? And I don't think there is enough of this cooperation. There isn't enough of talking across disciplines and bringing everyone into the room, experts from different areas, and really having a frank and honest conversation.
Okay, thank you. And Franz, your work at the Bureau of Investigative Journalists focuses in particular on so-called enablers. Explain how these enablers collaborate to facilitate the penetration of democracies by illicit finance and perhaps even the threat they pose to our security. Why are they so important, and what experience do you have through your reporting of this role that they play?
Thanks, Kinga. Yeah, I mean, so when it comes to enablers specifically, I think you kind of, it's important to say that the vast majority of people I would describe as enablers very much kind of play within the rules. But they still almost unwittingly kind of support the expansion of criminal activity or foreign influence, nefarious influence, and they do that quite strictly within the framework of what's legal and what's considered socially appropriate, unless you kind of have a Paul Manafort figure and they eventually kind of get hauled in one hopes. I think the thing to understand about enablers, and so I think the financial crime, corruption, national security bubble also connects very strongly with social justice, and I think it's important here to remember that social justice is such a key part of national security, and I think the fact that the enablers industry, and I'm not going to go into what that is because I assume we're on a level here, but we can talk about that. The fact that that is still, even though it's being talked about a lot at conferences like here, in practice, kind of regulation and enforcement oversight of those industries is still fairly negligible. And until that kind of picks up, none of it, we'll still be lagging behind. Just a quick example based on an investigation we did. Sorry, just briefly for those who don't know, the Bureau of Investigative Journalism is a non-profit journalism outfit based in the UK. We have separate teams, and my team focuses on enablers of corruption, handily. And we just published an investigation in the UK together with the Sunday Times, which looked at the use of hacking. And it focused on a sort of gang of hackers based in India, but their services were procured by private investigators based primarily in Europe, Switzerland, the UK, but also the US. And those private investigators often worked with British lawyers, and a lot of, and so you've kind of got this connection between British lawyers, indirect connection between British lawyers and Indian hackers, and the Indian hackers are targeting basically heads of state, and so, for example, the Swiss president or the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, figures like that. I mean, just to be clear, this is sort of email hacking, so it's not kind of advanced intelligence craft. But nevertheless, I think it's quite a neat example of that, the crossover from one end to the other.
Okay, thank you, Franz. And Sam, as the director of Democratic Resilience Program at CEPA, you try to push the boundaries of how both researchers and policymakers understand the threats to democratic institutions in the US, Europe, and post-Soviet space. And what are the biggest threats that offspring from regimes such as Russia and China?
Thank you. It's a good question, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. We hear a lot about malign foreign influence and influence from China and Russia and others, whether we're here or whether we're in various parts of Europe or other places around the world. And obviously, we see threats that now feel and seem a lot sharper now that we're dealing with war and in Ukraine, in particular, the threat of war in other parts of the world. And we'll get into the relationship, I think, between some of these avenues of influence and particularly financial influence and these sharper conflicts. But I think that to get to your question from my perspective, if we're thinking about the resilience of democratic societies, the resilience of democratic systems, then we need to be thinking a little bit less about what's coming in terms of attacks from outside, a little bit more about vulnerabilities from inside. So from where I sit, malign foreign influence, whether of a financial or a media or any other variety, really, is enabled and enables malign domestic interest. Right? It's when there are domestic actors that are become interested to use the opportunities that can be afforded by, for example, financial flows coming in from other jurisdictions, that we run into problems. And they might be interested in this because it provides them some degree of cushion and opportunity to mitigate against demands for democratic accountability domestically. Or it simply might distort their incentives in the direction of direct financial gain as individual political actors. So this money can distort incentive for actors at home. It can disrupt our ability to regulate, particularly regulate the externalities of normal profit-seeking activity in the economy. It can distort the accountability structures of institutions by beginning to make them beholden to sets of stakeholders that are not part of the legitimate democratic system. And talking about institutions, this is not just political institutions, but this is the institutions of our economy. This is the institutions of social regulation. These are things that my colleagues on the panel have already picked up on, but I would come back in particular to something that Justina said, which is the importance of ceasing to see this in a compartmentalized manner. In other words, we tend to see our roles as compartmentalized. We see government as the actor that is meant to be regulating and defending, right? And that means that organizations outside of government, right, can offload that and concentrate on what they take to be their own core activities, right? Civil society sees this activity as investigating, researching, and being a watchdog, but fundamentally not fulfilling the roles of governance. And the business community in particular, and professional communities, tend to see their roles as operating in whatever regulatory environment they are given. I think that one of the greatest threats continues to be the lack of a sense of a common sake in the production of governance, accountability, and transparency as a public good that affects and needs to be produced collectively by all of the members of this system. But we'll get into the details. Thanks again.
Okay, so as the main threats, we identified the naivety of democracies, that we are working in the silos, and lack of cross-cutting cooperation. We don't know the enablers, how they operate well enough still, and we don't concentrate enough on our own weaknesses and our own domestic actors and how they behave. So let's move on and discuss how to raise the defense, weak financial controls, and allow funds connected with state-sponsored organized crime to flow unquestioned into and out of democratic open societies. And the first line of defense should be to eliminate the internal loopholes in our own democratic systems by bolstering anti-corruption and anti-money laundering laws. So how should we raise European defense against malign financial activities of hostile state and build financial resilience? So Franz, first over to you. You have led many investigations for Bloomberg and now for the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, covering corruption in the UK and the US, and authorities have opened criminal investigations into some of the subjects after your articles were published. What should we do to put our own house in order?
Okay, I mean, just to start off with, to start off with a sort of anecdote. I mean, 15 years ago, I was based in Democratic Republic of Congo and started reporting on someone who was relatively unknown called Dan Gertler. And, I think I don't need to mention or explain who he is at this stage, but it took a few years for us to start reporting on him and to figure out what was going on. We started reporting about his relationship with Glencore, the commodities company. And, fast forward to today, and, he's been sanctioned. There's a second round of sanctions on him and his entities. Glencore has paid over $1 billion in fines. But the kind of the point I'm trying to make is how long all of this has taken. Some of the repercussions are still kind of slowly playing out. And actually, until fairly recently, at least, we know that Dan Gertler was still able to operate, obviously with a heavy tax, because once you're sanctioned, moving money is much harder, but it is doable. I think if we're going to combat this kind of activity. I'm a big proponent of enforcement, and I know Sam sort of said, we've all got to kind of play our role here. But I think that the sector or the part that's really lagging behind is enforcement. I think from a legislative perspective, quite a lot has happened. I mean, especially here in the US recently. In Europe as well. I think with the anti-money laundering directives, there's been quite a lot of progress. But from an enforcement perspective, the resources simply aren't there to really kind of root out most of the malign threats, but also to act as a serious deterrent. Sorry. There's also the way that, for example, financial intelligence units operate. At the moment, they pick up a lot of information. They do very little with that information. So figuring out those systems and actually getting them moving, if you kind of take it back to, how many politicians campaign on a basis of kind of security and policing and that sort of thing, it's kind of staggering that this is something that is just essentially ignored from a resourcing perspective. And just one brief other point is, I think, especially in Europe and including the UK, I think thinking about the balance of rights. I mean, everyone's aware of this decision by the European Court regarding UBOs and identification of UBOs. I think that raises some really serious questions, and thinking about how we deal with those. I don't actually have the answer to that at all, but thinking how we balance rights of privacy and transparency is a huge question that we need to kind of grapple with on quite a fundamental level to actually provide the legal framework for enforcement to take place.
Mm-hmm. And Tom, one of the projects you have led at RUSI is called Tariff, which included a focus on getting our own house in order too. So do you have anything to add to what Franz has said? Any specific findings of this task force?
Yeah, so that project, we love an acronym at RUSI. So Tariff, a transatlantic response to illicit finance. One of the things that we identified was, when you have the opportunity to talk to people around the world about their kind of illicit finance concerns, how often, of course, they hear my accent and they go, well, actually, our biggest problem is you guys in the UK, because that's where all the money goes. So stop coming here and lecturing us about raising our standards and all those sorts of things. Please, could you actually keep your side of the bargain and introduce the reforms and deal with enforcement and so on in your own country? And they absolutely have an important point. And the United States too. I mean, far be it from me to jest about what Jake Sullivan said, but it always amuses me when representatives of the American government talk about all these great reforms that they brought forward with the Corporate Transparency Act. Now, they are great reforms, but boy, are they overdue. And so I think we have to be really honest about the role that we as global financial centers play in facilitating this kind of action. There are plenty of people here at the conference this week from Moldova. I think they would have a thing or two to say about company structures in the UK that contributed to their pains. There are people here from Latvia who will very quickly and quite rightly point to things like Scottish limited partnerships in the UK. So we have a role that we must play. I'm not suggesting that countries like the UK don't understand that and are trying to take steps towards it. But getting our own house in order, back to point that was made earlier, looking at our own vulnerabilities and understanding how those vulnerabilities affect the global defense, I think is really important. And we can do something about our own vulnerabilities. It's more difficult to persuade other countries perhaps to take the steps that we'd like them to take, but we can look after address our own vulnerabilities. So yeah, getting your own house in order, or getting our own house in order, I should say, is I think something which we ought to emphasize much more than we do.
And Tom, let's zoom out and talk about multilateral tools to counter the damaging influence illicit finance has on our democracies. So Singapore took over the FATF presidency in July this year, and you've been to Singapore twice since then. How do you assess the role of FATF and other multilateral organizations when it comes to tackling the illicit finance that seeks to undermine our democracies? Do its priorities adequately address the most burning financial deficiencies of democracies under threat, or are there perhaps changes that need to be made or organizations that should be more central in this fight?
I think the first thing to say is that it's great that there is an attempt at multilateral cooperation, so I wouldn't want to see that disappear. I do sometimes, people always go, that's the guy who criticizes FATF. I can see positive things about the FATF, a lot of them. But I mean, I do think that sometimes we lose sight of the fact that what we're trying to do. So we're trying to, identify what risks we have, and then we're trying to deal with them as relates to illicit finance. And there are new risks that are emerging and that we are recognizing today that perhaps we didn't recognize a few years ago. So in that regard, we need to stop and say, well, are we approaching the problems that we've identified in the right way, or are we simply trying to kind of meet some standard which might have been written 30 years ago and which actually is either no longer relevant or needs to be updated? I'm sure everybody here plays G20 corruption commitment bingo every time there is a communique from the G20, and you say, well, let's have a guess which ones they're going to copy and paste from last year. And I think it would be nice to see, and we've done some work with people like the Accountability Lab, trying to track progress that's being made on these commitments. And that's, I think, what I would like to see much more of, is kind of almost the auditing of all these commitments. Are we actually getting our houses in order, or are we simply allowing ourselves to feel good about commitments that we are making? I feel quite positive about the direction of travel at the FATF at the moment, because I think Roger Kumar was here earlier in the week, and one of his priorities is asset recovery. You wouldn't have thought you had to say that asset recovery should be a priority when it comes to combating illicit finance and corruption, but asset recovery is clearly a hugely challenging issue. And again, it's no good us sitting here and lecturing people on what to do if the assets that have been stolen from their countries are sitting in our country and we haven't gotten around to returning them. So I think there's a lot that we can do ourselves as sort of global north financial centers, and we owe it to countries that suffer as a result of what happens in the UK, the US, and other financial centers to address those.
And Justina, the Sentry has conducted numerous investigations on how illicit actors around the globe conceal their operations and launder their profits through globalized system of finance. What should democracies improve in our own backyard to better counter kleptocrats?
Sure. So last year around this time, the Sentry published a report on the DRC, on the Democratic Republic of Congo, and funds embezzled from the country being invested in real estate in Maryland, just a few miles from where we sit. Franz talked about enablers generally acting within the rules. The rules need to change. I think that is the key. The rules still haven't changed enough. Tom mentioned beneficial ownership. It's coming too slowly. We've talked about the enablers. Yesterday, there was Senator Sheldon Whitehouse that was speaking here. One of the bills he sponsored is the Enablers Act, which would impose some AML, anti-money laundering obligations on professions, such as lawyers, accountants, company service providers, which do not have anti-money laundering obligations in the US. It's shocking. It's not in line with the FATF standards. But there are so many hurdles to passing that bill, and one of the key oppositions is lawyers. I'm a lawyer. I am shocked that lawyers continue to oppose kind of common sense regulation of enablers. I don't think there is truly an understanding of the issues and how important that is to national security. And it really goes to my first point, is that we're not talking to each other, right? More regulation, there's a knee-jerk reaction. Nobody wants to be regulated, but is there an understanding of why this is so important? So there are two parts to corruption, right? There is the looting of resources in country, but then it's always moved somewhere. As Tom mentioned, US, UK. We need to eliminate, it's much more within our control, eliminate where the money can go, because that will diminish the motive to loot. And more money will stay in those countries. More money can be used for development. Development aid will go much further if the money can stay where it belongs. And we really do have a credibility gap. The century, a lot of the countries we cover are in sub-Saharan Africa. And, you know, we point the finger of, you know, money being looted. This official has stolen the money, but then it often ends up in the US, the UK, or, you know, some offshore center. And it's the enablers. It's the very often the Western professionals that help that money move. So it's really regulation still. There's still a long way to go in terms of regulation. We've come a long way, but we can't stop here. We need to kind of continue the pressure.
Sam, as we already discussed, one of focus for you is Chinese influence, including a recent article looking at Chinese online influence in Central and Eastern Europe. For our RUSI Sanctions and Illicit Finance Monitoring and Analysis Network, SIFMANet, you can see the acronym on the slide, we were recently in the Czech Republic and engaged in some detailed discussions about the threat China poses. How should countries think about this threat, and what steps should be they taking to defend against its this malign influence?
One of the things that we found, again, in our research at CEPA, which is based entirely on views from the ground in Central and Eastern Europe, it's a rather long-running project that we've had looking at. We used to call it 17+1, now 14+1. It'll eventually, I think, just be probably 2+1 in Central and Eastern Europe, working formally with China. But China is present throughout the region. One of the things that we found, however, is that China is present not just in the media space, but in terms of investment, in terms of finance, in a number of different ways, in pretty much every country, or at least tries to be. But it's very opportunistic. Again, what it is able to do and the impact that China is able to have is highly dependent on the response and the structure of domestic politics and the relationship between political and economic interests in each country. So it's highly specific. China ends up having to be highly responsive to the domestic political environment. We find this is not just a China issue. This is also a very similar to what we see when it comes to Russian influence or any other influence operating in the Western Balkans and Central and Eastern Europe, in the Baltic, that offenses tend to take what the defense gives them and to use the opportunities that are made available. So it comes back to something I said in the first part of this discussion about the relationship between malign foreign influence and malign domestic interest. Right? Where are the opportunities being provided by unaccountable leaders or leaders who would like to be unaccountable, right? In order to make use of this. So tightening up on democracy obviously is one thing. There's a role for the European Commission to play in backstopping not governments but backstopping civil societies to hold governments accountable. I think there's also a role to be played in networking and information sharing and experience sharing among civil society throughout the region, understanding how contracts, particularly for investment and contracts that involve debt, when coming from China, how this works, what the opportunities are for using domestic legislation or Europe-wide legislation to impose greater transparency and accountability on those contracts to make sure that the terms are financially sustainable, and then that there's just greater understanding of if we've seen a project go a certain way down the road in one country, say Montenegro, for example, right? That others in countries where projects might be less well developed, right, or less far down the line, have the opportunity to see the potential trajectory, learn from both successful and unsuccessful cases of, again, enforcing transparency and accountability. At the end of the day, it comes down to what are the standards of governance, transparency, and accountability in the country, less than what are the interests emanating from a malign foreign power, whether that's Beijing or Moscow or anybody else.
And when we were with SIFMAnet, we are touring some European capitals with our project, and we've noticed that some Central and Eastern European countries are very vocal, especially like experts and civil society activists are very vocal about the malign Chinese influence in Europe, but I personally have a sense that it's not so much of interest of Western countries at this point, Western European countries. I mean, there's a different perception of the threat. Would you agree or not?
I think there's a number of things going on.
I mean, like Germany, France.
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. I mean, first of all, Germany, France, these are much larger economies, which have much deeper and thicker investment markets and many more vectors of both domestic and foreign direct investment. And so Chinese projects seem to fit in very differently, right, and feel very differently. They're often more confident in the ability both of regulators, and maybe not always rightfully so, but at least the discourse is more confident when it comes to the ability of regulators and civil society to get to grips with the potential both direct and indirect influence of China. There's a bit more familiarity. One of the things that we came across a lot in Central and Eastern Europe and the Western Balkans is that Chinese investment is a newer phenomenon. People don't exactly know what to expect and how to respond to it. That lack of familiarity creates anxiety. There is also fundamentally a lack of expertise and a lack of funding for that expertise. I mean, if you are a scholar working in the Western Balkans and you want to understand China and Chinese politics, pretty much the only opportunity you have to get funding to go and study China is coming from the Chinese government, right? And so there are structural issues as well when it comes just to the ability of civil societies, expert communities, and then following on from that, governments, frankly, to understand the landscape that is taking shape.
I will pass the mic over to Tom, but one more comment. Last week we were recording our festive episode of the podcast by CFCS that is called Suspicious Transaction Report, and I recommend all of you to...
Very festive.
Yes. And I did comment exactly on the Chinese... I made a comment about Chinese malign influence in Europe, but I also pointed to one more fact that in the U.S. National Security Strategy 2022, China is number one.
Yep.
Russia is number two. And I also do think that America will nudge European allies to kind of pay more attention to Chinese malign influence, also financial influence in Europe in the long run.
Yes.
Yeah. So Tom, you want to add?
Yeah, well, actually, that's a good segue because you see what Kinga did there, by the way, because in the podcast we said, at the panel last week, we said the following, and now she said it. When the podcast comes out, it will be true. But one thing, maybe to pick up a bit on what Sam was saying, one thing which I think is quite interesting is how some of this, let's just keep using the phrase, sort of malign influence, comes through vectors that are actually legal. So it's investing in companies, acquiring data through that, and so on. And this is where I come back to the point I was making at the very beginning about sort of negligence or being kind of asleep at the wheel, is that certainly in Europe we have not appreciated that, and I think actually nudging from this side of the Atlantic will be very important. So thinking about, we obviously have a what's it now called, the National Security Investment Act, whatever it is in the UK, where people are waking up to this idea that actually, yeah, maybe we need to have more controls on who buys our companies, who invests in our companies, because we don't want to be losing technological advantage just because we want investment dollars. So I think this kind of thinking is something that, in terms of defense, we need to be doing, and certainly in that regard, I think the United States is way ahead of Europe.
Okay, so we discussed the threat landscape, the internal domestic response to the threats, and now let's talk about the offense. In my opinion, and not only mine, the best defense is a good offense. So let's discuss how to effectively use restrictive measures, such as sanctions or excluding hostile governments from financial markets to harm them. Tom, sanctions have been the most visible international response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, yet many governments are incapable of effective implementation of sanctions. And for the SIFMANet project that we mentioned, and I also encourage you to check our website and to see more information about this project. We've been touring European capitals to gather information on challenges in the implementation of sanctions against Russia. So what would be your recommendations to make EU sanctions more effective?
Well, I think we have to recognize that the EU has achieved a deal of coherence and collaboration which nobody, I certainly wouldn't 12 months ago, have imagined that we'd be onto a ninth package without kind of cracks appearing in the, or cracks that mattered appearing in the unity. I mean, there are cracks obviously, but so far the unity has held. I mean, I think what we've discovered in the event programs we've been doing is that there is a reality gap between what you might hear in Brussels around what's happening on sanctions and actually what is happening in industries in, you've mentioned the Czech Republic, but we've been to other countries in the EU as well. And it's very clear that there's a lot more juice that can be squeezed out of the orange that we have in front of us at the moment. So yes, of course, further packages that respond to filling gaps and so on is important. But going back to the very beginning and saying, look, have we actually properly implemented all the sanctions that have been put in place over the last 10 months? Is there more that we can do there? And the answer is unequivocally yes, there is more that we can do. I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is in terms of offence, of course, is that there are plenty of countries around the world that at the moment choose not to sign up to the Allied sanctions regimes. There are some that have surprised, I think, the West by following sanctions that aren't from the UN. So Singapore is a country obviously people point to very often, but there are certainly others. But I think we need to be working on behalf of the Ukrainians. We need to be working with these countries that somehow seem to think it's okay to facilitate sanctions evasion by Russian actors. And we can all think of countries that I might have in mind. And I think there are three things we need to do. The first is diplomatic pressure, which I'm sure is ongoing regularly on a daily basis. The second is, and this is a kind of a shout out to all the investigative journalists and others who look into this stuff, we just need to keep publicizing cases of this occurring. I mean, there are some very visible ones. I'm sure we've all become experts in tracking super yachts around the world in the last 10 months. But Mordashev's Nord, which rocked up in the UAE, well, that's not a good look for the UAE. It then rocked up in Cape Town Harbour. Well, that's not a good look for South Africa. So these countries need to be presented with the evidence that there is an issue that you are frankly not adhering to, and do you really want to be the people that somehow are not supporting a country like Ukraine that is has been invaded by Russia? And then I think the last thing is that, back to a point I made earlier on, as a global financial center, you have responsibilities, but you also have actually considerable power if you choose to use that. And if you're the EU, for example, okay, the EU will say, UAE, it's your sovereign right to decide how to respond in the face of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But it's also our right as an economic bloc to decide that we don't approve of the way you're responding, and therefore we're going to take countermeasures against you. And that, I think, is something which is beginning to get some traction on the other side of the Atlantic. We should not be shy about using the economic power that we have to make it very clear to countries that are not supporting Ukraine's right to exist peacefully as a sovereign nation. And that's what I would like to see more of as part of the sanctions response certainly from the European Union.
And Tom, you are currently a specialist advisor on illicit finance to the UK Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee's ongoing inquiry. So please make sure to share your feedback
please,
with the policymakers.
Please will they not shut down the inquiry, which I was told. So I'm actually in the process of being sacked as a specialist advisor because the inquiry is being closed down, which is disappointing to have heard.
Can I just interject? Sorry, I've got a follow-up question for Tom, and maybe Sam has something to say on this. I mean, I think particularly around how, some countries are not enforcing sanctions or haven't imposed sanctions related to Russia, and there's this kind of theory that, some of these countries will be pulled over more towards the malign world. How big a risk do you see that as being, and how strong a force is that, and to what extent is there risk that consequently also kind of dirty money then starts centering? We're already seeing it with the UAE, but also that actually solidifying, and also other currencies, for example, gaining supremacy, and that whole dynamic. How do you assess it? I mean, either of you, really.
Go ahead, Tom.
Okay, I'll have a first go. I mean, the fact of the matter is that change the landscape, right? If you've been sanctioned, you're not going to sit there and do the same thing again, are you? Because you've learned a lesson. So the environment will change. But I think in reality, we just need to look at where are the gaps and what can we do to fill the gaps? Because ultimately, what is the objective? I mean, not many political leaders have really articulated the objective of the sanctions regime. But let's just say that the objective is to degrade the Russian economy so it cannot fund its war in Ukraine as much as it could 12 months ago. So we need to do everything we can to ensure that is what occurs, and that means that there will be gaps that we have to fill. We either fill those by diplomatic engagement, or we maybe have to start filling them by being more coercive. So country X, if you don't want to sign up to this mission, that's absolutely your sovereign choice, but that's the end of your access to the money markets of London or the markets of the EU or New York, whatever it might be. So I think those are thoughts that we have to have. The other thing which is quite interesting is we need to kind of maintain the effectiveness of what we've done already. So again, we know that the targets move, the targets change their modus operandi. And we need to be ready to respond to that. So, there was a recent story I think it was in Time magazine about there's just random increase of export of washing machines to Russia. Well, if you take a washing machine apart and pull the chips out of it, that's one really easy way of getting around the embargo on chip sales to Russia. So there's kind of stuff like that we need to have at the front of our minds to make sure that we are constantly retuning the machine, because people don't sit there and go, I'm sanctioned, I give up. They slither and slide around, shapeshift.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I think that there's different aspects of the sanction. There's sanctions that are meant to deprive Russia of specific things like chips and things that can be dual-use goods, and that requires, and I know that the government here is certainly doing a lot of work to track that and identify loopholes and pathways and crack down on washing machines and things like that. But then there's also the finance and trade angle. Now that obviously the issue with a ghost fleet of tankers that would be able to evade the European price cap. Obviously if Russia's going to work with Iran and North Korea on things like that, then there's only so far that we're going to be able to push with sanctions. So it is important to recognize the limitations of sanctions as well, and that they're not a panacea. But I don't want to presage what I think might be the next question, so I'll stop for a moment.
Yes, exactly. I wanted to ask, because Sam, you lived in Moscow for 13 years, and you focused on the relationship of power in Russia. So I just, indeed, I wanted to ask if you think that sanctions are effective tool to defend Europe from Putin's regime, and how they influence the regime so far. And again, what you've already touched upon are the ways in which the West should be adjusting its strategy against Russia. This is more maybe if you can concentrate on this.
So look, sanctions are important and they're inevitable in situations like what we've seen, starting from 2014, Crimea, MH17, Skripal and things like that, and then obviously since the full-scale invasion in February of this year. But as long as we're focusing on sanctions as a response to specific threats, we're always going to be behind the ball. Right? We're always going to be chasing the next actor. Now it's Russia. later, again, looking at the U.S. strategies, it's China. After that, it may be somebody else. But we're also chasing, the kinds of mutating vulnerabilities and pathways that Tom was talking about, right? So I think that, there's at least a couple of problems with that. It's not just that we're behind the ball, it's that the other side obviously has a powerful incentive, in fact, a more powerful incentive to be innovating in terms of how they operate and making themselves impervious to these sanctions. They can often see the sanctions coming. It takes us a while to get things running, and sanctions tools are structural and they're limited. We are a rule of law environment, and so we have to, the European structure is more limited in this respect than the U.S. structure, but still there are certain ways in which we do things that are predictable, and that makes them somewhat less useful. The bigger question, I think, is the one that you were getting to in terms of, what impact have we had on the way that Russia is governed? And that's not fundamentally a sanctions question. Right? I think we started the post-Soviet period with this assumption coming out of a lot of academic literature on economic reform and things like that, that if you began to create a capitalist class, right, that you would create people with a lot of money, and then they would demand rule of law to protect that money. And we were right and we were wrong, right? So we did create we helped Russia to create a capitalist class, and that was maybe a reasonable thing to do. But we were wrong about the specifics of the demand for the rule of law, right? So what we found was that all of these people that were all of a sudden generating tremendous amounts of money in a low rule of law environment, right? And you will always make more money in a low rule of law environment than you will in a high rule of law environment, did want to be able to protect it. But we allowed them to protect it in London and in Delaware and in other wonderful places around the world, rather than protecting it at home, which creates this wonderful opportunity for them for institutional arbitrage, jurisdictional arbitrage, right? They can have the best of both worlds, the high profit margins in a low rule of law environment like Russia, and Russia is not by far the only country to play this game, right? And the protections that we provide in our environments in the West, right? That, I think, is what we need to address, right? So the most powerful impact of sanctions, for me, particularly when we get to the level of sanctions that we're now imposing on Russia, right, is that it forces us to think. It forces us to think about what we're doing, right? It forces us to think that now we actually have to, if we want to have predictability, stability in our own economies, our own financial sectors, our own markets and institutions, right? That we need to think more openly and more strategically about our own trade-offs, right? About what we want, what level of openness we want to have, what the right level of accountability is, how we manage some of these things that colleagues raised earlier about the trade-offs between privacy and transparency, between governance and profit, right? And begin to build those assumptions into our own system. Right? If we can do that, right, then we actually begin to change the incentives for actors in other parts of the world. If it becomes clear that simply there isn't an opportunity to purchase the rule of law and legal protections for your assets, however you gained them, in foreign jurisdictions, right, then that all of a sudden changes the incentives that they have for how they think about politics at home. Right? So if that becomes the new normal, right, for Russian actors, then that, I think, is the most powerful impact of sanctions. Not the behavioral change that it creates in Russia in the first instance, the behavioral change that it creates in Germany and in the US and in the UK, and then the cascading effects that has on actors in Russia, in DRC, in China, anywhere else.
And I will pass over now to Justyna, but before I do that, I need to tell that some of you just ruined the structure of this round, which I call the best defense is good offense, while you are saying in terms of offense, sanctions are just like a kindergarten, and we still need to think much more about offense to make it a real offense. So hostile states, Justyna. Hostile states weaponize finance by creating alliances with corrupt individuals and kleptocratic politicians worldwide. And their illicit activities deprive their nations of sustainable development, facilitate global illicit financial flows, and advance the interest of states that undermine European security. And the democratic defense must address this and strengthen broad anti-corruption efforts. So how would you assess the current global anti-corruption regime? Where are we now? And what needs to be done to make it more effective?
So I think what Sam was talking about is that, after communism fell, everyone, came into Russia, made it a capitalist, tried to make it a capitalist country, brought business and thought this would all be great. But no one focused on the corruption aspect, right? Nothing was done to root out corruption. That was completely turned a blind eye to for a very, very, very long time. And really now what we're seeing, 2014, and as well as the more recent invasion of Ukraine, is what happens when a violent kleptocracy like Russia is allowed to run amok, like when its corruption isn't checked, when we're not doing enough, when we're happy accepting their money in London and all over the world and just turning a blind eye. This is the consequence of inaction for so many years. And I would argue that we should have done more in 2014 in Crimea with sanctions, right? One of my pet peeves I hear all the time is I've worked in sanctions for a very long time, and people come to me and say, sanctions don't work. Putin, hasn't changed his mind. He's still fighting in Ukraine. Sanctions clearly don't work. That's not the point of sanctions. The point of sanctions is not to change the mind of a madman like Putin. He's not going to change his mind. The point of sanctions is to cause that friction, is to deny the resources. It's not an efficient way to run a country or to run a war when you have to take apart washing machines. I also heard someone told me yesterday, someone from Kazakhstan came up to me and said, in Kazakhstan we've had an increased imports of milk pumps because they're taking them apart and using some component. So yes, these are all loopholes, and clever people will find loopholes, but they're incredibly inefficient, right? So sanctions one tool to degrade their ability to fight, and not just fight the Ukraine war, but also to exert the malign influence around the world. In Moldova, we focus on sub-Saharan Africa. A lot of malign Russian influence in sub-Saharan Africa. When Russia is seen as this powerful country, you're much more willing to work with it. So in terms of the anti-corruption regime, and we've come a long way, but I think there needs to be much more done. And in particular for Europe, it's very important that they're able to issue anti-corruption sanctions that are global in nature. So here I'm talking about the global Magnitsky-style sanctions. The U.S. has the ability, and tomorrow is Anti-Corruption Day, so that's when usually U.S. passes a lot of its anti-corruption sanctions. But it has a global Magnitsky anti-corruption regime, basically allowing the U.S. to target corrupt actors anywhere in the world. Since we mentioned Moldova, and the president gave a very stirring speech a couple of days ago, very recently, they used it against an official in Moldova, this anti-corruption regime. The UK has this kind of regime too, a sanctions regime. Australia does, Canada does. The EU does not have it yet. It's supposed to be in the works. Ursula von der Leyen said she wants it to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. And it obviously makes much more sense for the EU to be able to pass sanctions related to corruption in Moldova than the US. Moldova has much more interaction, I would think, with European countries than with the US. But Europe is not there yet. I hope we'll get there. You mentioned Dan Gertler before, a gentleman that we follow a lot at the Century as well. When he was sanctioned by the US, he moved to being paid in euros. This is not what Europe wants. It does not want to be the EU does not want to be the last place for kleptocrats to hide their money. And having that anti-corruption regime allows you to target some of these malign actors before there is a huge crisis, before there is an invasion, before there is a coup in some country, right? It's a global regime. The tool is there. You can use it as offensively as you'd like before we get to a crisis like we have now.
Yes, a very harsh critic of the EU, which as a European I second.
I'm not criticizing it. I just hope the EU
You're
has come a lot.
encouraging.
I'm encouraging. I think it's very important.
So I will ask a last question in this round to Franz, and after this question we will take some questions and comments from the audience, so please get ready. Franz, for years you have specialized in revealing how adversary states take advantage of our weak defenses. What should be the learning from the situations about how we as democratic nations should be more aggressive in our activities towards these states beyond just raising our defenses?
Okay, can we just cut the last few words?
Yeah.
In your question, because I think, this is kind of thematically coming back to what I think each of us has said, really is about building that resilience, and that goes to two parts. And, as Sam and Justine also said, the key thing is to make sure that corrupt actors don't have a safe haven for their money. And you achieve that by sort of cleaning up your own house. And one of the, I kind of said earlier, I think there's been a lot of progress on the legislative side, but clearly it's, a lot more needs to be done. And I think for me, one of the key problems is the lack of international collaboration or coordination. And I actually spoke to a US official just a couple of days ago here at the conference and asked him specifically about that. Not so long ago, I think G20 finance ministers met to agree kind of global standards on taxation. Obviously, that hasn't been followed through on entirely yet, but you do need that kind of top-level agreement and then also follow through on some of the key principles. And until that happens, I think there's always going to be this kind of jurisdictional arbitrage. And you talk about kind of offshore jurisdictions, and the sort of G7 countries have a huge amount of power over those jurisdictions. And they really don't exercise it, and they need to. Otherwise, there won't be, all those loopholes won't be closed. Also, just to come back to the kind of holistic approach, I was struck. So, in the UK, you probably all know that we have appalling kind of libel laws. And so we wrote an article at the beginning of the year about a Kazakh entity, and we've been sued for that article. And that's almost an everyday occurrence in London. And just to say, I think we'll be fine. But I was struck actually by Samantha Power's comments, because she actually landed on this, and this sort of Journalist Shield Fund, I think, is incredible because it lands on one of the key issues, which is kind of a holistic approach to transparency. So journalists, civil society, whistleblowers all need to play their part. And as we know, most of the information finds its way into public consciousness, and also, if you get to an enforcement side of things, then the first step is kind of entering the public domain. And without those kind of protections in place, it's kind of, obviously many countries have far greater, journalists in many countries have far greater problems than journalists in the UK. But until you kind of protect those rights, then I think you're in a lot of trouble, basically.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing, and I'm glad you mentioned some of those points that Samantha Power made, because a lot of what we've talked about, most of what we've talked about, is kind of worrying about dirty money heading our way, and what do you do with sanctions, all that sort of stuff. But let's not forget, we do have finance as a tool that we can use ourselves. The biggest global banks, the biggest economies in the world, and what are we doing to use that kind of financial power to kind of secure democracy and and take the kinds of steps that you mentioned. I can't imagine any other country in the world saying, you know what, we're going to set up a fund to ensure journalists from being sued, for example, or some of the other initiatives that she was talking about earlier in the week. So there is a tendency, I think, for us to kind of look at ourselves and go, oh, you know, we're the worst, and you know, perhaps we are. But there are plenty of positive things that we can do with the financial strength that we as a kind of collection of democracies have, and that we should definitely not forget.
Yes, Tom, I'm glad you mentioned this bit more offensive approach. I promise to take questions from the audience now, but one more question just to one of you, whoever wants to pick it up, because we really concentrate on getting our own house in order, but I cannot close this discussion without addressing a question: can we win this war alone? Because it's our own house is one thing, but equally important, we need to make alliances. So, Sam?
No, we can't, right? And I think what we've realized, it was a shock to the system, right? To our own view of the world, right? That allowing a country like Russia to run itself the way it was running itself could lead to a war. Didn't compute for us in the US, it didn't compute for the European Union. It did compute for Russian civil society and the Russian opposition, who had been telling us this for a very long time, and we didn't want to listen. We are closing in at this point, I think, all told, military aid, economic aid, humanitarian aid, on something like $100 billion support to Ukraine. If we have to spend twice or three times that much to make sure that Ukraine wins, it will be worth it. But can we think for a moment about what we might have been able to achieve with a fraction of that money if we had been listening to Russian civil society and Ukrainian civil society and Venezuelan civil society and Congolese civil society and Ethiopian, and I mean, I can go on, right? If we were spending that money now in lots of different ways, supporting initiatives that fundamentally, I think what this whole conversation has been about, right? Is that the problems that we are finding, right? It's not, you know, you said at the outset, you know, illicit finance, I actually wrote this down and quoted it, illicit finance seeks to undermine our democracies. Illicit finance is undermining our democracies, but that's not the point of illicit finance, right? The point of illicit finance is to allow politicians and powerful people economically and politically in other parts of the world to be unaccountable, powerful, and rich. Right? That's what it's seeking to do. Right? We used to think about that as their problem, not our problem. And what we've realized now, hopefully, is that it is our problem. I think that's one of the things that's driving USAID and some governmental shifts in this country to think about, actually, we need to spend money more proactively in other ways so that we don't have to spend hundreds of billions of dollars helping people fight wars that could have been avoided if we had taken governance as seriously as civil societies have been asking us to take it for decades. So no, we can't. Hopefully now we realize that.
Okay, thank you. So let's take some questions from the audience. Are there any questions? Okay, please. Okay, so we have two questions. Please identify yourself and just please tell if this is a question or is it a comment and who should address the question. Should I pass the mic on?
My name is Dimitrița Bologan. I'm from the Advisory Anti-Corruption Committee from Moldova. First of all, I very much like to thank you for these discussions. And as you probably know, in Moldova, almost 10 years ago, $1 billion has disappeared and defrauded from the national banking system. At the same time, almost $80 billion have been laundered through the Russian laundromat scheme. Up until now, during almost 10 years, the recovered money to the state budget is around 1%. And this long period of time made the efforts of the authorities. First of all, it was really difficult to understand. It took several years to understand the magnitude of the problem. And then to try to start and take action in order to go for the proceeds. I really commend RUSI's efforts in researching, understanding, proposing findings and platforms for discussion. My question is to what extent the governments, the Western governments and authorities are aware and are ready to take measures in order to either better cooperate or follow and sanction, because some of the crooks are still finding themselves, enjoying themselves in Western democracies, and the proceeds, many of them either in offshores, but many of them are still in the Western countries. This is my first question, and my second question is to what extent do we understand the threats of the illicit financing, money laundering, in the context of the Russian aggression. And in this regard, I would somehow follow the idea that we're chasing the ball in some respect, and in this regard, to what extent would we chase the ball in the future years? Thank you.
Thank you. Can you please pass the mic for the next question?
Thanks. For a comment for Mr. Green would be that in the Western Balkans, yeah, I mean, the Chinese influence is very present, but one of the reasons why this is so is a complete lack of engagement on the side of the EU with structural things like the green transition. That's why the Chinese investment in coal plants in Serbia and Bosnia, I'm from Bosnia, by the way, are so attractive, not because people like the Chinese so much, or not because the Chinese have necessarily bought domestic actors. And then a question for, I guess, Justina and Sam and Tom would be, to what extent do you think the changes to campaign finance legislation in continental Europe and the UK make sense or would be an important step in increasing the defense from malign foreign influence?
Thank you. We will take some more questions in a second. Let's just address the first two.
Should I have a go?
Yeah.
So I think to the question about, unequivocally, Western countries get it now. The problem is that having not got it for 25 years, there's an awful lot of. I got someone was talking to someone the other day, and they talked about sweeping out the Augean stables, which I haven't heard that phrase since I was studying classics at school. But that's essentially what we have to do, right? We have to pump out the sludge that we've allowed to come in over the last 20, 25 years, during which time we've either purposefully or negligently had the red carpet rolled out and providing all the services that you in Moldova, unfortunately, have been victims of. I think it would be. I would like to think that there is no Western leader who doesn't understand. The question is, what capacity do they have to do anything about it? One of the things that strikes us when we're doing these event programs for the SIFMANet project is how often people sit there and say, well, we're just in the process of updating our law on how to implement sanctions. Like, guys, it's late 2022, and only now are you updating the legislation that allows you to be effective. So I think we're a long way away from where we need to be. I would like to believe that the journey will continue, but it is absolutely critical that those that care about this in civil society and academia and elsewhere keep the pressure on, because we all know that as a story drops down the headlines, the pressure in our legislatures around the world risks dropping as well. And catching up, again, not to keep picking on Jake Sullivan, but I have this image of your average organised crime baron driving along in his car, and he looks in the rear view mirror and he says, oh yeah, I can see the US starting to catch up a bit with a bit of corporate transparency, but I'm fine for the time being. I'm going to keep on driving along. And so we've got to keep up the pressure so that actually legislation and everything else that goes with it does catch up with the bad guys. And collectively, that's something that we must ensure that we press forward on.
I think Justina, I want to, and then Sam.
Sure. I think, to the question from representative from Moldova, I think asset recovery is such a difficult thing that's really not being done enough. And I think there, obviously, with Ukraine and some of the Russian assets that are being frozen and perhaps seized, there's a lot of thinking going on. Is the asset recovery, forfeiture and asset recovery process working? Do we need to streamline it more? Because we rarely see asset recovery. In countries that we look at in sub-Saharan Africa, funds are frozen if they can be found. A lot of times we see that funds were in dollars, so we know the looted funds went to the U.S. financial system, but then no one follows up. And I think it's a matter of capacity, because the tools are there, but the capacity isn't there to really trace these funds, try to forfeit them, and try to recover them. But I think a lot of thought is given to this issue right now because, how do we pay for the Ukrainian war? Can we use Russian assets? How will that work? But it's a very difficult question because there is the issue of due process. And that is why asset forfeiture takes so long. The other issue is, if you forfeit the assets, you don't want to give them back to a corrupt regime. So are there government structures in the country you're returning them to sufficient so that, corrupt actors, this isn't just a windfall for corrupt actors. So it's a very, very difficult issue. I don't know if anyone wants to add on this or the other question.
Just very briefly on that. I mean, I do think that it is in part a capacity issue, but the capacity issue then interacts with a public awareness issue, right? Because yes, there isn't enough money being spent on policing in these areas, on the investigative capacity. But a lot of people in most Western countries, including this one, feel that there isn't enough money being spent on policing and law enforcement in general, right? And so finding $1 billion of money stolen from Moldova is not necessarily the first thing on people's priorities when they're thinking about, or when politicians are thinking about what they're going to spend money on, even if it's in terms of policing. I think there's an opportunity to begin to shift that, because I think that the situation, obviously, with Ukraine at the moment makes it a little bit clearer why we might want to care about things that happen in other places. But that will take some public education. There's a role for civil society. There's a role for politicians to take that conversation forward. There's a role for the media to take that forward. And we need to make sure that Moldovan and other voices are heard loudly and clearly. On the Western Balkans question, and it's not just a Western Balkans question. Yes, I mean, we often, in thinking about, why isn't the quote-unquote global South, I hate the term, but why aren't, parts of the non-Western world on board with us on Russia, on China, on other things, or in the Western Balkans? We often frame it here as though it's a question of rhetoric, right? We're just not getting a message across. The reality is that Russia and China and others are transactional, and they are able to help governments solve particular problems, including some real material problems. The Western world is, broadly speaking, not doing that. We're expecting our rhetoric to make up for absent transactionalism. And I think that, if we can provide hopefully, maybe, Scholz is recommitted to the Berlin process. I don't know. Maybe there is a future for European integration in the Western Balkans. Hopefully, right? If that sort of thing can translate into something real and material that societies can believe in, right? Then I do believe that getting European investment will be much more attractive than getting Chinese investment. But if the European investment isn't there, then what are we expecting people to do? And it's a very valid question.
Could I add to that? I mean, because it's not just a Western Balkans problem, as you said, and I think we really need to avoid talking about this as East versus West or choose U.S. over Russia and China, because from my experience, the countries don't like that. Choose the U.S., choose the West, choose the EU, because we're better than Russia and China. That's not a choice we have to give them. I think the choice we have to give them is that our investment is more long-term. If our products are better, this is the investment you have to choose. But I think to be able to do that, there need to be preconditions for responsible investment from the U.S. or EU or other countries. Because we talk a lot about, we work a lot on mining issues in East Sub-Saharan Africa, and we talk a lot about, companies. We say, it's just Chinese mining companies going in. What can we do to have companies with more responsible environmental standards, that don't pay bribes go in? And they're like, we're just too worried about the corruption. It's just not stable enough, so we need those preconditions. There's got to be those better governance in those countries, to be able to have that investment that I think ultimately would be more beneficial in the long run for these countries. And that's what's got to be made clear, not make a choice, the West is better than Russia and China.
You asked a question about, I think, campaign finance. And obviously the way campaign financing works varies considerably between countries. I think the question that, some of us here, or probably maybe all of us here, have worked for NGOs in our time. And when someone gives you money, a philanthropist or a donor, you kind of have to ask yourself why. It's great, thanks very much for the money. Why are they giving it to me? And I often think that politicians fall into the trap of not asking themselves, why is this person making me the donation that they're making me? I've spoken to sort of politicians about this, and they'll go, well, the person was an upstanding person. They passed all the checks. The source of money seemed to be clean. But the question then you have to ask yourself is, but why did they make the donation to me? And so I think it's particularly critical at this time because, frankly, Western democracies are very unstable, right? I mean, you don't have to nudge a Western democracy much these days to get a sort of change in the outcome of an election. So I think we do need to be very kind of alert to the way in which campaign finance works because, as I say, it doesn't take much for a 48-52 vote to become a 52-48 vote.
Franz, would you like to add something, or do we take another round? There are two more questions at least. So the lady in the second row, and then the lady in the red sweater, and then two more questions. We have a question from representative from Latvia, I think. Okay, so three questions now, and hopefully there will be another round. Can I? Oh, the mic is already there.
Two Latvians
two.
competing for a microphone.
Yep.
So I'm Inga Sprinje from Latvian Investigative Journalism Center. I've been in touch with some of you. Actually, it's a short comment on a positive note. I'm a very negative person. I'm not like this all positive vibes. But one of this billion, it went through Latvian banks. I did infographics myself, how it happened. On positive note, I'm thinking now, it was through Trasta Commerzbank and two other banks. I think all of them are shut down now. So something is happening, and it was shut down because of US pressure. Of course, it doesn't mean you can get back the money. As you mentioned, it's very hard, but there have been some changes. Of course, it's too late, and the money is still out there somewhere, but something has been done. Just what I wanted just to add.
Okay, so we will take your question, but maybe let's pass the mic over to Thomas now, and then over to you.
Yep, thank you. Is this working?
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. The light was shining on the microphone. It was sitting right next to me, so I had to take it. Tom's from FIU Latvia. My plan from like minute 15 into the very interesting panel was to politely, aggressively attack Mr. Wild on the comment about FIU's not doing enough. But there was something that Justine said very recently at the end of the panel about sanctions, about Magnitsky Act-like sanctions in the EU, and I really wanted to get all of your views about it. I'm very keen about sanctions. I'm a strong believer in sanctions, and I do think they work, but it's about sanctions that are about world peace, let's call it that. When it comes to corruption, anti-corruption-like sanctions, there is something we call human rights in EU, and we feel very strong about it. And one of the things there is a presumption of innocence. And the views I would like to get is about what do you think is the fine line between using sanctions, which is a strongly political instrument, for something that is not political whatsoever, which is fighting corruption, presumption of innocence, and those people also have human rights. And what do you think about it generally? Thank you.
Well, my name is Ana Gomes, and I represent TI Portugal. But I was a member of the European Parliament. I negotiated, I was in the teams that negotiated the 4th and the 5th anti-money laundering directive. I was in all the inquiry committees involving taxation, corruption. And I can tell you that I feel that there is a total disconnect with the political operators in the EU, namely in the finance ministries, who are, for instance, the ones responsible for anti-money laundering measures and banking measures and so on, and the security needs. Their needs are actually to cater to the banks and to the financial world, and not to actually restrict them because of the security implications. Not even to mention the more strategic implications, but even the basic primary security implications of, for instance, fighting terrorism, because anti-money laundering is also about fighting the financing of terrorism. And I can, the same in taxation. And I do remember the EU, there was an anti-corruption report in the EU back in 2014, the year of the invasion of Crimea. And it was disconnected. And this was done by a commission you wouldn't expect to do that, Malmström. I remember, for instance, when the European Parliament went to the Maidan, and amazing people from TI Ukraine showed us all the mapping they had done about the assets of the oligarchs invested in European countries, and they told us, just act, apply your own laws. Act. And the resistance was tremendous. The resistance was tremendous. So, look, the VAT, carousel fraud. Last week, a major investigation launched by the PPO, started in my country, by the way, about VAT fraud, carousel fraud. This investigation amounts to something like over 2 billion. But actually, since 2018, the Commission, Moscovici at that time, had identified that about 1/3 of the EU annual budget, over 50 billion, was being deviated every year in carousel fraud. And the ministers of finance had been asked by the Commission to make small adjustments in the VAT law to actually prevent it. And till this day, this hasn't happened. Till this day. Is it, so there is this disconnect with the real need to fight corruption and illicit financing and organized crime, because it is about organized crime and capture of our states, European states. That's what it is all about. And so, in what concerns sanctions, I come from a country where the foreign minister has announced a few days ago that there are 80 million frozen assets on enacting sanctions. Oh, about 2 months ago, it was 242 euros. And in the meantime, a lot of people, including TI Portugal, has written to the government to find out and to offer our services to help enact the sanctions, and nothing was done. So now this number pops up magically. It's not at all credible. And and my question would be, what we see now is that indeed the influence of we were talking about the country that has given the nationality to people like Abramovich and Rappaport and many others. And what we are seeing, and this is my question, is actually that part of that money is invested in controlling our media. And I'm sure this is not only happening in Portugal. And by the way, our media, one of the most pro-Russian reporting media in Portugal today is CNN Portugal. They were clever enough to go for the franchise that would... So my question is this happening? I'm sure it is happening in other places. What can we do when indeed they are trying to control the media and the journalists who are in this, as you said, very crucial sources in exposing all that?
Anna, I'm mindful of time. We've
Just
really,
one
we've
more-
really missed you in the European Parliament, by the way.
Yeah.
The
But the other thing that I just would like to say is, we see how, for instance, they are using now data protection in a perverse way, for instance, to stop the access to the UBO Central Registry. This is, it's not new. And we have to figure as well some arguments and a strategy to fight this, not just regarding UBOs, but in general. Because data protection is being used as a way to deter, indeed, action in this field. And I won't go into this, but China is even worse than Russia. It's even worse.
Okay, I think we can possibly all agree on that, which is saying something.
Sorry.
I have a one-sentence
Okay,
question.
one sentence is okay, and then we wrap up. And
What, if anything, would the deterrent effect be of criminalizing sanctions violations like they do here in the U.S.?
By the EU?
Yeah.
They just have them.
Yeah.
And they do
What's
in
the
the UK.
deterrent effect going to be? Do you have any?
Well, I mean, let's wait and see how they use those powers. Shall I have a first go?
yes, please.
So the first thing is, fortunately, Anna, our program at RUSI is called the Center for Financial Crime and Security Studies for precisely that reason, because we've always tried to look at these things through a security lens. I think the one thing I would say to kind of try and cover a lot of the points that have just been made, which is that we have to constantly think about how we create new tools. I'm sort of struck by some of the tools that are used in the United States, like geographic targeting orders, these kinds of things, unexplained wealth orders that some countries have introduced or are trying to introduce. If we sit there and think that the analog toolbox will work in a digital age, then we're going to lose every time. And the last thing I'd say is when we identify loopholes, so things like investor visas, citizenship by investment, that sort of thing, when we identify those, it is criminal, with a capital C, not to fix them. And too often we don't. And I think we need to have ways in which, particularly in the EU, where you get your visa to come into the EU, you come in through Malta, that's it. You've got 26 other countries you can enjoy. So we must close down on those loopholes. But I think creative policy and legislative making is what we need. Come up with tools that actually deal with the problems we face, rather than trying to fight today's war with the tools from the past.
To go to your sanctions question, I used to work at OFAC, the sanctions authority for the U.S. government, and due process is obviously an important concern, and that's why we're freezing assets, we're not seizing them, the judicial process comes to seizing them. And I would say that there is due process, right? At the European Court of Justice, the EU is losing lots of cases. In the U.S., I think they're doing better just because it is seen as a national security issue. It's not a sanctions issue, it's a national security issue. But I can tell you from my experience, I used to be a lawyer for OFAC. So before there was a designation, it came to my office, lawyers reviewed it, and then it went to the Department of Justice. So there was 2 levels of legal review because it is taken so seriously. And I would finally say that I think the anti-corruption sanctions are, for global, for global peace and global good, because corruption is so intertwined with atrocities, with human rights abuses. And I think they are better sanctions than some of these very political sanctions like the U.S. has on Cuba, because they can be used more neutrally, because they're not targeted at any specific country. And going back to Gertler example, he's Israeli, U.S. ally, right? So this is an example of this being used against a U.S. ally, someone from a U.S. allied country, which is rare, and it needs to be done more often. But I think it's easier to do with kind of a global sanctions regime focuses on anti-corruption.
Franz, any final thoughts?
I mean, mostly just to agree with what Tom and Justina just said, and also, it's a good thing that many of us live in rule of law jurisdictions, and I think one key thing is obviously for the war in Ukraine, it's too late, but it's important that people do seize this opportunity, or governments seize this opportunity, and actually actively now close down loopholes. And so this really is more than a wake-up call, and you'll see the effects down the line. just very briefly on the FIU point. Yeah, I mean that was a very small point, and we'll chat about it afterwards. It's getting into the weeds a bit.
And Sam, anything to add on top of agreeing with Justyna, Tom, and Franz?
Sure, I certainly agree, but I would go one step further, right? And this also gets to Tom's question about sanctions. Sanctions are important, and these anti-corruption sanctions and Magnitsky-type sanctions do have an impact. They do shape people's incentives, at least in some cases. Not enough, right? But I think you're right. It does raise rule of law issues, and it doesn't fundamentally solve the problem, right? I think what solves the problem is when we actually go, again, a step beyond what everybody's said. Everything that's closing loopholes, getting better at identifying, chasing down, and interdicting illicit financial flows is important, right? But I think we need to stop pretending that this is entirely a technocratic issue. And a law enforcement issue, and begin to see it more broadly as a rule of law and a social contract issue. And have these conversations openly about the trade-offs, about how we want transparency to work in our financial and property markets, about who we want to be able to have access, about how we want to open our own systems, both to ourselves and to others. To me, that we in fact don't have to impose sanctions, right, to keep nefarious people and nefarious money out of our systems, but we have systems that are built to keep that money out from the ground up.
Many thanks to Justyna Gudzowska, Tom Keating, Franz Wild, and Sam Green. And Tom and Sam, you both have silent E at the end of your surname. It's very interesting. And to all of you, the audience, for joining us today for this CFCS panel at IACC. Thank you very much.